Hello out there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, humans of all ages. It's Peter Melton on Extinction Radio, and today I get to speak with and share a conversation with you all with a delightful man with a funny name who I got to meet a year ago, and his name is Zhiwa Woodbury. Welcome to the show, Zhiwa.
Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome. What is the name? Tell me about your name. Where did that come from for you?
Oh, that's my Dharma name that was given to me when I took refuge many years ago, and it means Nirvana's peace. And when I renounced my legal career, I decided to renounce my legal name as well and take on a new personality and, just do that whole impermanent shift thing. And so I took on my Dharma name.
Great. Thank you. I first heard an interview with you on Carolyn Baker's Lifeboat Hour and felt like I really had to connect with you right away, and it's been good over a year now since we've been in touch and had you on Guy McPherson's show as well, and been waiting for the time to get you on Extinction Radio, and here's that time. So welcome to Extinction Radio, and why don't you give just a brief rundown of what it is to be Zhiwa and how you got here.
Oh, gosh. We don't need to waste too much time on that because I told you I'm Buddhist, so, that all of that's illusory anyhow. But, I just think of myself as an advocate for the earth nowadays and all our inhabitants and, all those different roles that I've played in my life, they all kind of seem to have added up to that and kind of prepared me for this. And, I like to call myself an eco-psychologist now and then, and I think of myself as a writer, and, of course, I self-identify as a Buddhist. But these are all just labels, and I'm a human being trying to make sense of the world just like you and everyone who's listening, and a human being in relation with the world,
Yeah, trying to make sense of things is quite the place where we find ourselves, and, well, that's part of the title of your upcoming book, right? Climate Sense?
Yeah, it is. Climate Sense, changing the way we think and feel about our planet in crisis.
Yeah, it sure seems like one of the hardest things for us humanoids is to feel into and talk about challenging topics. We've gotten so comfortable or used to the path of most comfort.
Yeah, that's my job, is to make people feel uncomfortable.
Well, welcome to the show. That's our purpose here, too. We're going to dare to talk about extinction and all issues around the possibilities and probabilities and the actual happenings already of that wonderful word. So you're in the right spot. You're in the right spot. So, we talked a little before the show, and you mentioned that what you'd like to start with on this anyway is about how do we come to grips, how do we even inform ourselves about what's going on, and what role does denial play in that? And let's have you talk a little bit, as you mentioned in your notes, about denial.
Yeah, I think it's a fertile starting point, and it's really come into a lot of things have really come into focus for me since the Paris Climate Accords. And so, the reason I feel like before I used to kind of, chafe against the idea of denialism, and I feel like, but that's the lens we've been looking at the climate crisis for years. It seems like that's all the press is focused on, and that discussion focused on, and the science, and who accepts the science and who doesn't, and who's trying to pay to, all the, and I feel like it's a total false dichotomy that's sucked up way too much energy, and I suspect giving way too many people a safe way of avoiding actual engagement with the issue. Because the fact of the matter is we're all in denial about climate change. Even, that term betrays a kind of collective denial. Climate change, like, really? The climate is changing? That doesn't make it sound very serious. It makes it sound more like the weather or something. And so, this idea, well, the way I view climate denial is that it occurs along the spectrum, and it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just a natural psychological defense mechanism, which kicks in whenever we feel threatened. And, who doesn't feel threatened by the climate crisis? So what happened with the Paris Accords is really interesting to me because it shows how futile it is to continue to focus so exclusively on climate science. So, none of the world leaders in Paris denied the basic facts of our situation, and they, I think 1.5 degrees Celsius is probably a rational goal that they agreed on, and yet the accords themselves provide no way of actually reaching or stopping at 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, all of the commitments that were made put us on a track of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is, a very scary place. And so if nothing else, the Paris Accord teaches us that acknowledging the serious nature of anthropogenic climate change in no way ensures that we will take appropriate action. And that clarifies the real issue, which is what, this continuing lack of any rational response to the crisis. What is that about? Why are we not responding as if our life depends on it? We've acknowledged it's a matter of life and death. And so that's the kind of denial that I'm referring to when I say we're all in denial. And we see this certainly at the collective level. But I think it's true also. Go ahead.
I just, when you reframe it that way, it's such a powerful thing that how is it that we're all in denial? How can we make this something that we're all experiencing, and reframing what denial means that you put in some of your notes here, the focus on science itself is becoming a form of denial that
right.
puts us in a whole different place.
Yeah, and I think that if you, it's kind of like this, because I think that this plays out on the collective level and it plays out at the individual level of you and me as well. It's like we've all received this terminal diagnosis, and this is just an analogy, but
kind of
from our doctor, right? It's like you go to your doctor and he says, you've got 1 year to live if you keep eating the way you are currently eating. If you radically change your diet, you've got a good chance of living 5 to 10 more years. And we leave the doctor's office with this new knowledge, and we don't mention it to our loved ones. And we keep going along the way we know will lead to our early death, maybe secretly hoping that a magical cure will be discovered before we get there. So we're not in denial about the information or even the seriousness of that information. We're in denial about what it really means, especially in relation to who we are and the way we live our lives and how we relate to each other. So, Pope Francis really gets this. And in his encyclical, he said the climate crisis is asking us to reconsider what it means to be human. And that is so right on. But you'll notice the press did not pick up on that, even though it's his main point. So, instead, the press picks up on the science, how the Pope is doing with science and how people think, the Pope's relationship to science should be. That is, again, it's all obsessed over that. And what I'm saying, is like, forget about the science, okay? The science is pretty well settled, and there's very little that can be gained from continuing to trumpet the latest findings on ocean temperatures and methane feedback loops and ice melt or whatever, The real question we need to be asking ourselves is this: why this disconnect between what we know to be the threat and how we are choosing to respond? Once we
say that, let's state that again. What I really find in these interviews, Zhiwa, is it really helps to repeat some of these key things, or could just pause for a second. It's so, again, I think that's our system. There's so much to say, and there's so much juicy in it, but I really want to just go back what you just said, the disconnect between what we know and how we choose to respond. And I love your analogy about, bringing it really down home into our humanity. The doctor says if you keep doing it, you're going to die in a year. And yet we go home, we can acknowledge that, okay, this is serious, and I'm not denying the seriousness of it. I just have no capacity to urge myself forward into some new, different kind of thinking or action. And I don't want to tell anyone because they're just going to challenge me to do it, or
In fact, you probably go home and eat some comfort food, like grab that Ben and Jerry's out of the freezer. Oh my
exactly.
God. Yeah.
So repeat that line again before you go forward. Then, why the disconnect?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, to me, this is the real question. Why this disconnect between what we know to be the threat, climate crisis, and how we're choosing to respond? And once we begin to see the crisis as a question of dissociation, which is a fancy psychological term for this disconnection between our thoughts and our actions, between the threat and our dissociated response to that threat, once we see the crisis in that way, that at that point we can no longer avoid dealing with the real underlying issue, which is trauma. From a psychological standpoint, and I've studied psychology my whole life, and and eco-psychology is basically where I've ended up at because it's the most relevant to our being of service in the world and the situation that we're faced with. From that standpoint, if you want to know why someone's harmful patterns of behavior are so dissociated from what they know will be the consequences of those behaviors, you look for evidence of trauma somewhere in their history. Trauma literally means wound. And, they say the cure is close to the wound. So traumatic events involve an overwhelming amount of real or perceived threat to our sense of security. And they demand extraordinary coping efforts due to their extreme nature. So we're not just talking about, a car accident or something like that. We're talking about something that overwhelms our sense of identity. And
right. And that line, the cure is close to the wound. Another one of those things that just rang right through me to say we've got to dare to go to where that wound is for ourselves individually and collectively and psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, the whole gambit.
Yeah, because if we start looking at the climate crisis through this lens of trauma, we'll not only find answers to the most vexing questions that everybody is just throwing their hands up about now, we'll actually find answers to questions we didn't even realize we had. And collectively, all these answers will all start pointing towards some way out of this morass that we're just now entering. It's not going to happen overnight, but and it's true, we no longer have the option of averting a climate crisis. It's upon us, but nonetheless, we have a moral obligation to do everything we can to sort of soften its blows for future generations, for other species, for our children and so forth. And the truth of the matter is that the changes that we undertake today on our own or in community could end up making all the difference in the world for the survival of a particular species 40 years from now, because that's the lag time that we're operating within. The things that we do now in relation to the climate have effect 40 years from now. And what we're experiencing now is because of what we were doing 40 years ago. So, again, by viewing the crisis through this trauma lens, we also begin to involve our hearts more in the process, and we start building the kind of resiliency that will be so important as the crisis really begins to take hold. So,
yeah, boy, that's the whole next step of things, right? How do we develop these capacities to sense what's going on inside ourselves and collectively, even now, ahead of, if you will. I mean, sure, stuff is happening now all over the world, but it really hasn't hit the mainstream, if you will, of America anyway. And boy, what a tidal wave of confusion lies there.
Yeah, and you know, and you know, I mean, I think that's part of the disconnect we're having, is that we think the answers are out there. You know, the climate is out there, the crisis is out there, and so the answer must be out there somewhere. You know, but it's not. It's within, and you know, the people that are leading the way to some, you know, out of the existential crisis are those spiritual leaders, you know, the Llewellyn Vaughan Lees and the Joanna Macy's of the world, you know, that are dealing with this at a feeling level, at a heart level, and creating the kind of impassioned leaders that you know, that are going to end up having a bigger impact than the scientists and the politicians and so forth. So we should talk. I mean, what I find in talking about this, Peter, is like either, you know, not everybody understands what trauma is. You know, if they haven't experienced serious trauma in their life, or someone in their family, you know, hasn't, then they don't necessarily know what the basics are. So we probably should talk just a little bit about you know, basic psychology of trauma, and then we'll bring it you know, home to the climate crisis.
Please. I appreciate this different window into the psyche and into how we look at what's going on and what's real for ourselves. So please, let's go there.
Is the rabbit. It's a rabbit hole. This window opens up and you never come back.
Whee! Here we go. Turn off your radios if you don't want to go.
It helps to red pill, blue pill. It helps to remember. It helps us if we remember that psychology in the West actually began with Freud's consideration of trauma. He was dealing with traumatized patients, and he famously developed what came to be known as the talking cure. And the more we talk about it, the deeper we go into it, the more we'll appreciate just how necessary it is to see the climate crisis this way. So the first thing to appreciate is how climate chaos is framed by trauma on both ends. In other words, as you and I know, and probably most people listening know, dealing with this existential crisis and all the suffering that it's causing is in itself traumatic and overwhelming. We've got hundreds of species going extinct every day. The polar cap is melting. We're seeing floods of refugees sweeping up out of Africa. And the more we take all of this in, the more traumatic it becomes for us. So that in itself becomes a barrier to effective response, because trauma distorts our ability to see our world clearly, to relate to it as it is. So the climate change mentality is necessarily clouded and kind of delusional. The trauma we experience when we open our hearts up to this unfolding crisis triggers the same kind of psychological defenses that are causing the crisis in the first place, like fear, aggression, as we see with some people, politicians, and a kind of bunker mentality that reinforces this view of ourselves apart from the natural world. The world and its climate become the threat out there, which we will, to the extent we are able, view remotely from ourselves, turning our focus towards our world in here that we have some control over, where we can find comfort and security from the same lifestyle that's killing the planet. So it's like that just like that, coming home from the doctors and going to their freezer for Ben & Jerry's, that's my comfort food. You know, even though it's the Ben & Jerry's that the doctor just told you that's going to cut your life short. It's a contradiction, but when we're threatened and feeling insecure, you know, we look for comfort wherever we can find it.
Yeah,
so,
the analogy shows up for me right there is that, and this has happened for me. In fact, it was a large part of maybe the first half of a year or more of me diving deep into this topic is this feeling like I'm watching a movie, right? That I am separate from it all happening, and this is just some big, crazy sci-fi thing that's happening, and I can watch it and eat my popcorn, and when it's done, I can go, whoosh, that was crazy, and then I, you know, hop in my car and go for a ride and whatever, you know, like it's not part of me, this ability to separate our own earthly home from who we are.
What's important to recognize there is that that's a natural psychological response that is not necessarily reflecting reality, right? That's just a natural response when we're, you know, like when the dinosaur jumps at us, you know, we shrink back, and yeah, anyway, that sort of just remote viewing and that sort of contradictory behavior is the meaning of dissociation, and it is a reflex defense. You know, when we're confronted with overwhelming threat, we dissociate ourselves from the experience of the situation as much as possible. So when we're threatened, emotion trumps reason, and you know, dissociation is defined quite simply as the human capacity to mentally escape an insufferable reality. So here, and this is like goes hand in hand with trauma. And then here's the problem that we face. It is this dissociation that you were describing from the natural world that gave rise to the climate crisis in the first place. And then the climate crisis, when we open ourselves to experience it, our defense is to dissociate from that natural world. So again, if I can put this in a more personal context, I think it'll help us get a perspective on what we're talking about here. The irony of dissociative behavior related to trauma is that they tend to perpetuate the very trauma that gives rise to the need to dissociate. This is just true in general. So take a difficult case where someone has been sexually violated so early in their emotional development, they're not actually able to be consciously present when that violation occurs. They check out cognitively and end up having no conscious memory of the incident because, in truth, they were not capable of experiencing what was happening to them. That's a case of extreme trauma, and it's how we learn to dissociate from experience. So what happens next for that person, as they grow and they develop and mature over time, they develop patterns of behavior in their relationships that tend to recreate the drama of the unexperienced trauma, such as entering abusive relationships, including the relationship to themselves, substance abuse, eating disorders, self-mutilation. And until such time as they have somehow recovered that memory of early trauma, early abuse, it doesn't matter what you say to them about their behavior. They'll even agree with you, but claim they can't help themselves, which happens to be true. So does this sound familiar in relation to the climate crisis? Is this ringing any bells?
Wow.
You know, to draw another parallel, to sort of broaden this out from the personal perspective. Whenever we have a mass shooting in this country, it seems random, and we end up having the same futile debate over gun control or mental illness, and we never really address the underlying cause of violence or acknowledge that we happen to live in one of the most violent societies in the history of modern civilization. Nobody talks about that because we refuse to deal with the underlying trauma. nothing ever gets done. And we move on to the next celebrity marriage and then until the next mass shooting, right? And then we go through the same thing again and the same debate. And it's like repetitive dissociative behavior. And it's not that different than what we're doing in relation to the climate crisis on a national scale. On a global scale. We allow ourselves to get bogged down in this futile debate over what the science says and what it doesn't say. And it's the same kind of technological approach to the natural world that got us into this mess. It's all about, trajectories and predictions and, scientific models and acquiring knowledge and learning about the climate crisis as if it is not us that is in crisis.
Yeah.
What we need to consider and focus on is not how all the pieces of the climate puzzle fit together into our objective model of externalities, but rather the cycle of trauma and dissociation that is implicit in our own subjective and dysfunctional relationship to the natural world, which is crying out to us in distress. Then, only then, will we begin to discover insights into how best to respond to the crisis.
Yeah, to dare to go to the wound to find the cure, as you said, to dare to that these traumas that we have we're then drawn back toward them, and maybe somehow magically drawn back toward them because the cure is near there, right? That somehow innately we're trying to figure this out by taking ourselves back there, but we're lost in this misidentity or the way we've done this dissociative behavior that we don't see, that we keep circling back to the same place.
Yeah. What you're talking about, Benjamin White talks about in his paper in the current issue of Ecopsychology, and he says the residue of traumatic experiences from our past becomes present when we encounter anything that may be traumatic or threatening. As such, trauma is quite alive in our relationship to nature itself and to climate change. That was a quote from Mr. White. And so it's not a scientific issue. It's not a political issue. It's not a technological issue. It's a relational issue. And it involves and incurs the residue of our past traumas, which is why it's so difficult for people to really come to grips with this, or to really get clear and respond to it, because you want to just sort of recoil back into the comfort of your lifestyle. We can all relate to that, right?
Yeah, so much.
That's why I talk about like healthy denial. Denial is a healthy sort of in itself. It can be a very healthy psychological defense, because you and I, from what we know about the climate crisis, if we really responded proportionally to that threat, we would be basically walking up and down a sidewalk 24/7 with a sign, like the world is going to end. The world is going to end. It's overwhelming. So we have to be able to put it out of our mind in order to function and carry on with our lives, right? So to me, that's like managing. You manage your denial. You're not denying that it's real, but you deny it periodically. You just have to be able to put it out of your mind, and that's a healthy coping mechanism. There's nothing wrong with that. Right. But there is something wrong when there's something wrong with it collectively when that's all we're doing.
Right, and that collective part is another key part there. You talked about the personal trauma, but let's talk collective trauma. What cards were we dealt? What cards were we dealt with all this?
Well, and this is what I've been focusing on for the last 3 years now, because it's this idea of cultural trauma, which we're going to get into here, and sort of taking this trauma to another level. And I've become, in my study and research and writing and meditation and so forth, I'm really convinced that this is the key to changing the way we think and, more importantly, the way we feel about the climate crisis. Because as long as it's only addressed in our head, it's like like focusing on the science or intellect. It's our collective conduct is not likely to change fast enough. It's not some math problem that we need to figure out. So now that we pivoted from denial to trauma, we'll take it to the next level, and that is viewing the climate crisis through the lens of cultural trauma. And this is where it gets really interesting. Through this,
well, yeah, it hasn't been interesting up till now. I'm glad that we're going to get something interesting.
I'm trying to
do a radio show here.
It's a rabbit hole.
To get some listeners here. Come on.
The deeper you go, the more interesting this becomes.
Curiouser and curiouser.
Exactly, Mad Hatter. So you are the Mad Hatter. I've seen you on Facebook. So cultural trauma. Listen to this now carefully because this is really important. Cultural trauma.
Okay, yes, class. Pay attention, class. Quit messing around. Get your ears on. Put your pencils down.
Cultural trauma, which is a fairly recent development in psychology, refers to a dramatic loss of identity and meaning associated with an unhealed wound in the collective memory of a social community. So try to keep these three elements in mind as we proceed to discuss this. Collective memory of an unhealed wound that dramatically undermines the way we think about ourselves, our cultural identity. This kind of trauma does not need to be experienced directly by any or all, but it nonetheless becomes embedded in our social memory like a kind of a cultural meme. And a recent example that everybody will understand right away is 9/11. We weren't all there in New York when it happened, but it's the kind of monstrous event that embeds itself in our consciousness and can overwhelm and undermine an entire culture, as we're now seeing with the rise of a fascist element in politics and so forth, not just here but all over the world, France and Germany and so on. In his latest book, Our Only World, Wendell Berry considers the rootedness in cultural trauma of the kind of mass killings that are becoming almost routine, horrific acts like Sandy Hook and Boston Marathon bombing, or the more recent shootings in Charleston and San Bernardino. This is what he says: "We congratulate ourselves perpetually upon our Civil War, by which the slaves were, in a manner of speaking, freed. We forget, if we ever learned, that the same army that freed the slaves established for us the right of military violence against a civilian population, and then acted upon that right by a war of extermination against the native people of the West. Because this genocide is deep in our cultural DNA," I'm not quoting anymore, he goes on and concludes that nobody who considers our history should find anything unusual in the massacre of civilians and their children here on American soil. And yet we do. We're perpetually shocked whenever someone massacres civilians and children here. And yet we barely respond at all to civilian massacres that include women and children, or even wedding parties carried out in our name overseas. And why is that? America has this idea of itself, ourselves, as a just society, that one that does not sacrifice civilian populations of women and children in carrying out just wars. This is part of our cultural identity. So much so that when he was accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, President Obama insisted that the United States of America must remain the standard bearer in the conduct of a war, suggesting in the name of peace that the way we wage a war is somehow superior and more ethical than the way other countries wage war. This idea is also implicit in the obscenely dissociative term collateral damage. It's like we would never intentionally target women and children. No, not us. But hold on here. If we look at what happened at the end of World War II, we will begin to appreciate how our culture became so traumatized that we are seemingly incapable of responding to an existential threat like the climate crisis. The atom bomb created a moral dilemma among Americans. We'd always seen ourselves on morally higher ground than the rest of the world, especially in regards to German concentration camps and Japanese death marches. But shortly after his plane dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the co-pilot of the Enola Gay wrote in his diary, "My God, what have we done?" By our collective silence in the wake of World War II, it's been said that the average American became like the average German during World War II. And there you see the beginning of this dramatic loss of identity and meaning that began a process of unraveling the social fabric of American culture. And what I've come to appreciate in my own research and contemplation of this atomic rendering is that this trauma was unlike any trauma we'd previously experienced. And we'd experienced some serious traumas, right? But think about it. We called it the cosmic bomb, and President Truman referred to it as the basic power of the universe, which we now held. And, basically we now control the fundamental forces of nature, forces that for as long as we humans have been around, we've always associated with Creator God. So much like Prometheus in Greek mythology, we stole the power of the sun from the gods, brought it down to earth at the end of World War II. Do you remember how the gods punished humanity for Prometheus's plunder?
I do not.
Pandora's box, unleashing all the problems that have plagued civilized society since. So listen carefully to what future Pulitzer Prize-winning poet James Agee wrote in Time magazine days after we nuked Japan, and see if you can't get some deep feeling for the severe psychological trauma associated with America's introduction of nuclear terror into the world. This is fascinating. This is what he said. "The greatest and most terrible of wars ended this week in the echoes of an enormous event, an event so much more enormous that relative to it, the war itself shrank to minor significance. The knowledge of victory was as charged with sorrow and doubt as with joy and gratitude. In what they said and did, men were still, as in the aftershock of a great wound, bemused and only semi-articulate, whether they were soldiers or scientists or great statesmen or the simplest of men. But in the dark depths of their minds and hearts, huge forms moved and silently arrayed themselves, titans arranging out of the chaos an age in which victory was already only the shout of a child in the street." And now listen to these last lines from Agee in light of what we've been talking about with trauma and dissociation. "With the controlled splitting of the atom, humanity, already profoundly perplexed and disunified, was brought inescapably into a new age in which all thoughts and things were split and far from controlled. As most men realized, the first atomic bomb was merely a pregnant threat." He writes and then repeats himself. "All thoughts and things were split. The race had been won. The weapon had been used by those on whom civilization could best hope to depend. But the demonstration of power against living creatures instead of dead matter created a bottomless wound in the living conscience of the race. Conscience. The rational mind had won the most Promethean of its conquests over nature and put it into the hands of common man, the fire, and put into the hands of common man the fire and force of the sun itself. In a similar vein, the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, remembered the first successful detonation, the so-called Trinity test, this way. We knew the world would not be the same. And as he beheld this radiant blooming cloud in the deserts over New Mexico, he famously was reminded of a passage from Hindu scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And so some of us might be thinking, come on, this was 70 years ago. What does that have to do with American culture and the climate crisis today? But here's the thing that is so important to understand. When cultural trauma is not adequately processed, it becomes internalized and is passed on to subsequent generations. This has actually been proven genetically, which is kind of amazing in itself. And according to studies in the 1960s of the children of Holocaust survivors, not only is that trauma passed on intergenerationally, but it intensifies with each generation until it is finally dealt with. So listen, because this is where things get really, really interesting, not just real interesting, but really, really interesting from a cultural and psychological perspective, scientists now agree we've entered an entirely new geologic age where the world is being reshaped by mankind, the Anthropocene. And guess what? They've marked the beginning of this new age from that radiant blooming cloud in the White Sands Desert, which we call Trinity. So everything really did change. And just as James A.G. foretold, a new age had begun, an age where everything was split, nothing more so than the split of mankind from nature. Almost immediately, we replaced natural materials like wood and metal with a human creation, plastic. We split cities from pastoral areas with a new artificial world called suburbia, further insulating us from the natural world. We reinvented the food chain itself with industrial agriculture and factory farms, better living through chemistry, we were told. We replaced natural remedies developed over eons with pharmaceuticals developed in laboratories without much concern for unintended side effects, since we could just treat those with even more chemicals. And we even convinced ourselves that formulas fed through plastic nipples were somehow superior to the most natural connection of all to nature, our mother's breast. All of this happened quite precipitously in the wake of World War II. And the more you think about that this post-World War, the more shocking it becomes. Do you know Rebecca? Wow. Do you know Rebecca Solnit?
I do not.
She's an editor for Harper's Magazine and writes about social justice. You should friend her on Facebook and climate issues. And she maintains that World War II never ended. And I happen to agree with her, though she's looking at it from a perspective of politics and the technology of war, while I'm agreeing on the basis of psychology.
Wow. To feel into this last 15 minutes or so that you've been sharing deeper, wow, I feel like I'm in that wound that we were talking about, that needing to get closer to the wound to find the cure, to as I think about, okay, I'm going to have to wrap this up in a few minutes, how does this get wrapped up? And this part of me wants to say there is no wrapping up of it. This is being in the wound together and daring to just feel in and sit with, wow, the cultural wound and all the cultural energy that has blown through all these last 70 plus years, taking us where we are individually and collectively and globally. And here we are facing another one of these threats that we have no or very limited capacity to grasp or be with.
Yeah, we're really hurting. I mean, that's the point, and we're doing everything we can as a culture to take our minds off of this bottomless wound, as A.G. called it. one of the symptoms of severe trauma is that it exists in an eternal present. It kind of freezes us in time and leaves, and Sigmund Freud talked about trauma as like a foreign body, which long after its entry into our psyche must continue to be regarded as an agent that is still at work. And so that's what we're talking about. Is like we lost that connection to the natural world at the end of World War II, and we haven't come to grips with that. We pressed that idea. We had this idea that we had won the world and we could create a better world, and for a while it really seemed that way, that the modern world was somehow going to be better than what we had come from. And I think right now a lot of people are waking up to the fact that, wow, that was a real big misstep.
Right.
It's not nice to fool Mother Nature, right? And she's getting our attention, with her symptoms, and calling us back to our true nature. And that's that. And I think Pope Francis and I would agree on this. That's the actual cure to the climate crisis, is human beings getting in touch with human nature and remembering what human nature really is. Once we do that, everything flows from that. And the quickest and most expedient way, because I know you need to sort of wrap this up, but so I just want to leave the listeners with this. The quickest way, and it's happening, for humans to reconnect to human nature and the natural world is through our mouths and through our stomachs, through getting back to eating food that is not chemically enhanced, that is coming from fertile, rich soil where all the nutrients come from, and avoiding, meat from factory farms, which are like modern sort of perpetuation of the concentration camps from World War II, right? We just sort of took those concentration camps and put animals in them. The more we get away from those sources of big ag and factory farms and support and grow natural food and connect to where our food is coming from, which people were connected to before World War II. They knew where their food came from. Not only do we become healthier, we somehow magically become more in touch with what it means to be human. The healthier we become in our mind and our body, I should say, the healthier we become in our mind, right? And, I mean, the beauty and the amazing miracle of that is that also happens to be the most promising solution to the climate crisis, because, people don't quite appreciate this. But if we could, this is amazing, and I think this is something to lead people to think about. If we could stop emitting all fossil fuels tomorrow, stop burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, the climate crisis will continue, the CO2 levels will continue to grow, and the world will continue to warm. If, on the other hand, we were to convert all big agriculture and eliminate all factory farms and convert all large agricultural farms, the monocultures and chemicals and blah, 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 with regenerative agriculture like organic farms, the climate crisis would reverse overnight, even if we continued burning fossil fuels at our present rate. So that just shows the connection to the earth through our mouths and our stomachs has incredible potential, and that just also shows how the earth, a sentient being herself, is calling us back into relation with her through the way we live our lives, through the way we connect with our environment and the planet every day, 3 times a day, through the way we eat. It sounds counterintuitive, but as an eco-psychologist, and someone who's been a lifelong activist on these types of issues, I can tell you, that is like the most promising. It's going to happen, and the quicker we can make that happen through community, through organizing into the food movement through our community. Not only do we come into community with each other and with the earth, but we actually start feeling good about the way we're relating to the climate crisis.
Oh man, Zhiwa, thank you so much for daring to go to these depths with us. Where do people connect with you most effectively?
Google Planetary Hospice, a website where I tend to blog and have some synopsis of my book that will be coming out later this year or next year, and also Planetary Hospice on Facebook. It's planetaryhospice.com, and it's hyphenated, but just Google Planetary Hospice, and that's the best way.
Again, thank you so much for spending this time with us, and thank you for moving humanity through you in the way that you are, and being willing and daring enough to share this deep experience and expression of where we find ourselves.
Yeah, I know it's overwhelming, and I know that we're all traumatized, but, the one thing I also say is, like, I don't think anybody's been thinking about this or going into it quite as much as I've been for the last few years, and it's something I've been following my whole life. And I can tell you, the deeper you go and the more you think about it, I mean, I'm quite optimistic. I have total faith in human nature and our ability to overcome impossible odds. And, I'm convinced that we're going to get through this, and we're going to actually, be better as a species once we do get through it. But we're in for a difficult ride. So, get on and strap in.
There we go. Thank you again, Zhiwa Woodbury. Appreciate you being on the show.